The debate hall was electric, a sea of flashing cameras, reporters huddled in anticipation, and the faint hum of muffled conversations. It was a showdown. On one side, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, a man whose career had been built on navigating controversy and cutting down opponents with sharp, calculated jabs. He was in his element, cool, confident, a seasoned political warrior who'd weathered countless storms without so much as a scratch. His expression was unreadable, but behind those steely eyes, there was arrogance, the kind that comes with knowing you've been untouchable for so long. On the other side, Kamala Harris. Calm, composed, and resolute. No stranger to pressure, she had faced unimaginable challenges on her journey, from breaking barriers in a system stacked against her, to confronting the toughest critics with grace and poise. But tonight was different. Tonight was about more than just politics. It was about truth. The moderator called for the next question, and the air in the room seemed to shift. Pompeo leaned forward, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment where he could throw a challenge that would rattle Harris. So, Senator Harris, Pompeo's voice boomed through the microphone. You've made your fair share of promises, haven't you? But let's be real for a second. What does your idealism have to offer the American people when it's facing real-world threats? You stand there preaching unity, but at what cost? Do you even understand the gravity of national security? The words were sharp, aimed to cut deep, to expose any ounce of vulnerability. He was used to seeing opponents flounder, their words fumbling as he relentlessly pressed. But then, without missing a beat, Harris straightened up. Her eyes locked with his. She spoke softly, but the weight of her words was impossible to ignore. Mike, she said, her voice unwavering. Real strength doesn't come from intimidating others with fear. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The room went dead silent. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. Pompeo, the master of debate, the man who had crushed his critics with ruthless precision, was now staring back at her, speechless. The audience was frozen, unsure of what they had just witnessed. It was as if the world had held its breath. Pompeo opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. For the first time in his political career, the master had been outclassed. But what happened next left everyone in the room, and the millions watching, dumbfounded. As the room sat in stunned silence, the significance of the moment began to unfold beyond the confines of the debate stage. This wasn't just a political argument, it was the embodiment of a deeper clash, one that went far beyond the personal rivalry between Kamala Harris and Mike Pompeo. This was about the very soul of America. Over the last few years, the country had been shaken to its core. The divide between left and right had become an insurmountable chasm, and the lines between truth and falsehood had blurred until they were barely distinguishable. The political landscape had shifted, as the old norms gave way to the new, where deception often triumphed over honesty, where fear was peddled as a political tool, and where the ideals of justice, equality, and unity were constantly under attack. The American people, fractured and exhausted, were left asking, what kind of nation do we want to be? The ideals that once bound the country together seemed increasingly fragile, threatened not only by external forces but by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. And in that moment, on that stage, Kamala Harris was offering an answer. She wasn't just speaking as a politician, she was speaking as a defender of the American dream. A dream where dignity, inclusion, and the pursuit of justice mattered more than power or privilege. A dream where the future could be shaped not by fear and division, but by hope and unity. Mike Pompeo, on the other hand, had spent years as a stalwart defender of the old guard. He had risen through the ranks of the political elite by mastering the art of fearmongering and division. To him, power was about maintaining control, manipulating the narrative, bending the truth to suit his agenda, and ensuring that the establishment remained firmly in his grip. His rhetoric was about drawing lines in the sand, pushing the idea that America could only be great if it turned inward, closed its doors to others, and saw the world through a lens of suspicion and animosity. This wasn't just a disagreement over policy or ideology, it was a fight for the future of the country. The values Harris represented, the belief in compassion, inclusivity, and the pursuit of justice, were in direct opposition to Pompeo's brand of nationalism, which thrived on fear, division, and power at all costs. The country had reached a tipping point. For those watching, this debate was more than a political contest, it was a referendum on what America stood for. And as Harris calmly made her point, the tension in the room escalated. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't about winning a single debate, this was about deciding what the future of America would look like. Would it be a country defined by empathy, opportunity, and shared prosperity? Or would it succumb to the dark forces of division and fear? For Pompeo, this moment was supposed to be a victory. He had prepared for it, armed with his usual arsenal of scorn and bravado. But now, facing a Kamala Harris who was unyielding in her convictions, it was clear that the tables were turning. And the audience, the millions watching at home, the voters whose futures would be shaped by this moment, began to sense the gravity of it all. Every word exchanged, every glance shared, felt like it would determine the course of history. It was no longer just about politics, it was about the values that would define the next chapter of America. But what happened next would change the way America viewed both of them, and everyone watching would feel the shockwaves. The clash wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Mike Pompeo was no stranger to controversy. His political career had been built on a foundation of calculated risk, ruthless maneuvering, and a sharp disregard for anything that stood in his way. To him, power wasn't about service or duty, it was about control. And for years, he had navigated the treacherous waters of American politics with a kind of ease that seemed almost invincible. Pompeo's rise was anything but accidental. He knew how to play the game, knew how to manipulate narratives, bend the truth, and maintain a calculated distance from the fallout of his decisions. When he entered Congress in 2011, it was clear that he wasn't there to make friends. His relentless focus on achieving his own objectives, coupled with a knack for cozying up to the powerful, quickly propelled him up the ranks. He was a master of messaging, always careful to spin his actions in a way that worked to his advantage. To those who saw him only from the outside, he was a shrewd politician. To those who got closer, he was a man who could make you think he was your ally, until you realized you were nothing but a pawn in his game. But Pompeo's success didn't come without a trail of ethical compromises, controversial decisions, and public contradictions. As head of the CIA, he ran the agency with a mix of cold pragmatism and personal ambition, willing to sidestep inconvenient truths if it meant protecting his own reputation or furthering his agenda. His role in pushing the narrative of WMDs in Iraq, his support for controversial surveillance programs, and his unwavering loyalty to a political administration that was increasingly seen as morally bankrupt had already earned him a reputation among critics as someone willing to do whatever it took to secure power. In 2018, when Pompeo was appointed Secretary of State, many viewed it as the final confirmation of his status as one of the most dangerous figures in American politics. He was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in Washington, the willingness to sacrifice truth and integrity in the pursuit of personal and political power. Pompeo's actions in this position were no less controversial. His complicity in the Trump administration's foreign policy decisions, from the handling of the Saudi Arabia crisis to the disastrous exit from Syria, only reinforced his image as a man who put loyalty to power above the best interests of the nation. What made Pompeo so dangerous wasn't just his ability to spin a narrative, it was his ability to escape accountability. Time and time again, his mistakes were brushed aside, his misdeeds downplayed, and his failures redefined as successes by his loyal followers. He knew how to manipulate the media, sidestep scandal, and dismiss critics with condescension. To Pompeo, the rules were for everyone else. He was untouchable. He had learned early on that the key to survival in politics was not humility, but the ability to withstand criticism by showing no sign of weakness. He had mastered the art of the smear campaign, deflecting blame, and always spinning the story back in his favor. His opponents, no matter how righteous, were dismissed as naive or idealistic. He used fear to maintain control, fear of global threats, fear of an uncertain future, and sold the American people the idea that only he could protect them from the dangers outside. But despite all his success, there was a darker side to Pompeo's arrogance. His dismissiveness toward opposition, the way he belittled anyone who dared to challenge him, created a growing resentment among those who saw through his smokescreen. His long history of defending indefensible actions, brushing aside scandals, and portraying himself as an infallible leader was beginning to wear thin. The public, and even some within his own party, were starting to question whether his bravado was truly the sign of strength, or the mask of a man terrified of being exposed for what he really was. Yet, through it all, Pompeo had remained calm. He had weathered every storm, always emerging unscathed. He had no fear of losing, no fear of being found out. He was untouchable, at least, that's what he thought. The moment in the debate with Kamala Harris was the first sign that the carefully constructed empire he had built was starting to show cracks. For years, he had crafted his image, impeccable, unshakable, in control. But in that brief exchange, something shifted. His confidence faltered, his facade cracked. Harris hadn't just challenged his policies, she had challenged his entire narrative, the very foundation upon which he had built his power. And in that silence, that split second where he was left speechless, something fundamental had changed. He wasn't untouchable anymore. But as the nation watched, one thing became clear: for the first time, Pompeo's confidence was cracking. The man who had once manipulated the public with ease was now left scrambling for words, trying to hold on to the image of himself that had always been his greatest asset. And the audience, both in the room and at home, could see it, could feel it. Pompeo wasn't the invincible force he thought he was. His downfall had begun, and it was unfolding right before everyone's eyes. Kamala Harris wasn't born into a world that guaranteed success. She didn't inherit power, nor did she benefit from a privileged position in society. Her story was one of grit, determination, and an unyielding belief in the promise of justice, a belief that would define her entire career. Born to immigrants, Harris's upbringing was steeped in the values of resilience and the pursuit of equality. Her mother, a scientist from India, and her father, a Jamaican economist, instilled in her a sense of purpose that was grounded in the ideal that the fight for fairness is a fight worth winning. From a young age, Harris understood what it meant to stand up against adversity, to push back against a world that would often try to silence you, and to speak out for those whose voices were overlooked. Her parents taught her to never shrink in the face of injustice. The lessons came in the form of words, but also through action: her mother's fierce commitment to breaking barriers in a field dominated by men, her father's passionate discussions about systemic inequality. They weren't just teaching Kamala what it meant to be a person of integrity, they were showing her how to navigate the world as someone who could fight for others, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As Harris entered the political arena, she carried these lessons with her. But she quickly realized that breaking into the system wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. The political landscape was a battleground of its own, a place where ambition and power played by different rules. For a woman, for a person of color, the challenges were even greater. She was often told she didn't belong, or worse, that her voice didn't matter. Her very presence in spaces where decisions were made was, to some, an affront. But Harris didn't shy away. She leaned into the fight, using every setback as fuel for the fire that drove her forward. She was relentless, not just in her ambitions, but in her commitment to truth. Her career as a prosecutor gave her the chance to advocate for justice, to stand up for victims, and to dismantle systems that perpetuated inequality. As district attorney of San Francisco, she fought for the rights of those who were most vulnerable, taking on powerful forces and delivering on promises that many had thought impossible. She didn't just prosecute criminals, she prosecuted the systems that enabled criminal behavior in the first place. Her work was far from easy. She faced immense criticism, especially from those who saw her as an outsider, as someone who didn't fit the mold. There were times when she was asked to soften her stance, to compromise, to accept the status quo. But Harris wasn't someone who bent to pressure, especially not when it came to the principles she held dear. She pushed back against the system, calling out injustices even when it meant standing alone. And each time she did, she gained more strength and clarity about what mattered most, standing firm in her convictions, no matter how loud the opposition became. By the time she ran for U.S. Senate in 2016, Harris had already proven herself as a force to be reckoned with. Her rise to the Senate was nothing short of historic, but it was also a reflection of the deep foundation she had built. She didn't arrive in Washington, D.C., to play games. She arrived to be a voice for the voiceless, to challenge the powers that be, and to make the government work for the people it was meant to serve. Every decision she made, every step she took, was grounded in the values of fairness, justice, and the truth that she believed could heal the divisions in the country. Yet, despite all her accomplishments, Harris's presence in politics was never embraced by everyone. Her political opponents, often from the most powerful factions, fought against her every step of the way. They mocked her stance on reform, they downplayed her abilities, and they tried to undermine her at every turn. But for Harris, this was just another part of the battle. She had faced obstacles far greater than these before. She had faced sexism, racism, and the doubts of those who thought she should know her place. Each moment of resistance had only reaffirmed her commitment to the cause. She was not here to play small. She was here to challenge the very systems that perpetuated inequality. Her success in rising above these challenges was rooted in something that Pompeo, no matter how hard he tried, could never understand: humility. Harris's ability to stay grounded, to never forget where she came from or who she was fighting for, gave her the clarity and resolve to navigate the darkest moments of her career. While Pompeo believed that power was a weapon to be wielded and manipulated, Harris saw power as a responsibility, a means to serve those who had been left behind. And that responsibility guided her when she entered the national stage, when she began to face the likes of Pompeo, men who had come to see themselves as untouchable, as the natural leaders of this country. But Harris knew something they didn't. She knew that real leadership wasn't about maintaining control at any cost, it was about leading with integrity, staying true to one's values, and always remembering the people you were meant to serve. Kamala Harris wasn't just prepared for this moment. She had been preparing for it her entire life. The obstacles she had faced, the battles she had fought, had all led her to this exact point. And while Pompeo might have thought he could steamroll her with his arrogance and dismissiveness, he was about to learn a hard lesson: Kamala Harris wasn't just a politician. She was a woman on a mission to restore justice, fairness, and truth to the heart of American politics. Little did Pompeo know, Kamala Harris had been preparing for this moment her entire career, and what she would say next would leave him scrambling for answers. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing second. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through. Kamala Harris sat tall, her calm demeanor almost a direct challenge to the rising storm in Mike Pompeo. He had been rattled earlier, but now, he was determined to regain control. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping the desk in a sharp rhythm, a signal of growing agitation. "You really think the country wants to hear your idealistic platitudes about unity, don't you, Senator Harris?" Pompeo's voice rang out, more forceful this time. "This isn't a fantasy land where we can just hold hands and sing Kumbaya. The real world is about tough decisions, about protecting our borders, about securing our national interests. What you're offering is a fairy tale, and it won't survive in the harsh reality of global politics." The words hit with a force that was meant to rattle her, to make her question her approach. Pompeo's tone was venomous now, sardonic, dismissive. He was attempting to drag her into his narrative, to paint her as naive, as someone unprepared for the rough edges of the world. But Kamala Harris remained unmoved. She took a slow breath, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She was steady, unwavering. She wasn't there to shout back, she was there to dismantle his arguments, piece by piece, with calm, surgical precision. "Mike," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What you're describing isn't strength. It's fear. Fear of change, fear of progress, and fear of what an America united looks like. Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. You're afraid of the very ideals that make this country great. You've spent your entire career playing into division, whether it's on the global stage or right here at home. Pompeo recoiled slightly. There it was again, the truth, cutting deeper than any insult. She wasn't just attacking his policies, she was exposing his entire worldview. But Pompeo was quick to recover. His smirk returned, albeit tighter, more forced. You want to talk about fear, Senator Harris, he retorted, his voice rising. You want to talk about division? Let's talk about the real threats we face, terrorism, rogue states, hostile foreign actors. While you sit here talking about unity and compromise, our enemies aren't waiting around for us to catch up with your division. They're exploiting every weakness, and you're too busy dreaming to see it. The audience could feel the heat between them now. Pompeo was fighting harder, pulling every card from his well-worn deck, scaring, posturing, manipulating. It was clear he had nothing left to offer except fear. He was losing control, and the harder he pushed, the more it became evident. But Kamala Harris didn't flinch. Her response was deliberate, fact-based, and clear. Mike, she said again, with an air of quiet authority. The only real weakness this country has is its unwillingness to stand firm on what's right. You're right, there are real threats out there. But let me remind you of something. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. Real strength is about recognizing that we don't need to destroy to protect. We don't need to incite fear to stay safe. In fact, it's our ability to build partnerships, to lead with diplomacy and justice, that has kept us strong for over 200 years. Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the fiery rhetoric Pompeo was throwing around. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the sound of a few deep breaths, some shifting in their seats, as if they were just now realizing the very real difference in how these two approached the world. Pompeo, visibly rattled now, tried to regroup, but his voice cracked. His carefully crafted narrative, the one he'd been repeating for years, was slipping away in front of him. His attempts to project dominance were only exposing his desperation. Don't preach to me about strength, Kamala, Pompeo shot back, his tone harsh. You've been living in your bubble, isolated from the real challenges we face as a nation. You don't understand the weight of the decisions we have to make, the lives that are on the line. Your vision. It's a luxury, a fantasy. But Harris wasn't rattled. In fact, she grew even more resolute, her next words cutting deeper than any attack could. Mike, let me remind you of something even more important. You don't get to define what strength is for this country. Our strength comes from who we are, from the core of our values. Not from putting walls up and closing off the rest of the world, but from reaching across those walls to build something better. It's not about playing games with people's lives, it's about ensuring that every person in this country has a shot at the American dream. The tension in the room was now unbearable. Harris's words were sharp and deliberate, and for the first time in the debate, Pompeo's facade was starting to crumble. His hands, once poised on the table with confidence, now trembled slightly. His eyes darted nervously, as though trying to find a way to turn the tide. But it was too late. The crowd could sense it. Pompeo had been reduced to frantic, empty gestures. His rhetoric was running out of steam, his attacks falling flat against Harris's unwavering composure and crystal-clear convictions. Every word he spoke now seemed like a last-ditch effort to salvage a battle he was losing. As Pompeo grew increasingly agitated, Kamala Harris poised herself for a counterattack that would leave him speechless. She wasn't just about to win this debate, she was about to expose the core of his failure, something he could never recover from. The tension in the debate hall reached its peak. Mike Pompeo was visibly unraveling, his attacks growing more frantic with every word. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, remained the picture of composure. Her unwavering confidence, her calm demeanor, and her precise command of the facts were now her weapons, an arsenal against Pompeo's bluster and fear-mongering. Pompeo had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her. He had expected to crush her with his well-worn playbook, scare the audience with threats, paint her as naive, and assert that only his brand of strength could protect the nation. But Kamala Harris wasn't playing that game. She had waited for the right moment to strike, to expose Pompeo for what he truly was, a man of contradictions, someone who spoke of strength but whose actions betrayed him at every turn. Pompeo's voice rang out again, this time more forceful, desperate even. You can sit there and lecture me all you want, Senator Harris, but the facts speak for themselves. This world is a dangerous place, and your peaceful approach, is nothing but a fantasy. We need leaders who are ready to make the tough calls, who won't shy away from the hard decisions. He leaned forward, staring her down with that same, familiar smugness. The kind of smugness that said, I'm in control here. But Kamala Harris wasn't intimidated. She had seen this before, she had faced down men like Pompeo all her life, people who believed they were untouchable, that their power and their narrative were beyond reproach. But she wasn't backing down. She took a slow, deliberate breath and looked him straight in the eye. Mike, she began, her voice soft but sharp, you talk about strength, but all I hear is fear. You hide behind the rhetoric of toughness, but let me remind you, strength isn't about threatening others. Strength is about standing firm in your values, even when it's hard. Strength is about having the courage to look at the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. The room went quiet, all attention focused on her. Harris wasn't just making an argument, she was making a statement. A statement that would reverberate far beyond this debate. Let me remind you, Mike, she continued, her voice steady, when you were Secretary of State, you promised to put America first, to defend our interests at any cost. But what you didn't tell the American people was how you turned a blind eye to human rights abuses, how you prioritized the interests of dictators over the values that this country was founded upon. You chose power over people, and you did it time and time again. Pompeo's face tightened. He was used to throwing out insults, used to being the one in control. But now, he was the one being held accountable. Harris's words landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away at the layers of defense Pompeo had built over his career. She wasn't just pointing out his hypocrisy, she was laying bare his entire philosophy, exposing the fragile foundation upon which his power was built. You sat there, Harris went on, her voice growing stronger, and talked about protecting America, but you didn't protect the people who needed it the most. You abandoned the very values that make this country great, values of freedom, of justice, of fairness. You put our interests ahead of the lives of the people who depend on us. And that, she paused, is the real danger to America. The audience was on the edge of their seats. The energy in the room had shifted. Kamala Harris had turned the tide, and it wasn't just her arguments that were hitting, each word she spoke was an emotional blow, a call to the moral compass that most Americans held dear. Pompeo, who had once exuded confidence, was now visibly shaking. His face flushed with frustration, his jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to speak, but Harris didn't give him the chance. She had already won this moment. Let's talk about your so-called strength, Mike, Harris said, leaning forward. You've spent your career exploiting fear, pushing an agenda that divides this country, that makes us weaker. You've sold the American people the idea that the world is a place to be feared, and that the only way to survive is to close ourselves off from others. You've put your interests ahead of the very people you claim to protect. You have made us weaker, not stronger. With every word, she dismantled Pompeo's narrative. She wasn't just confronting him on policy, she was calling out the very foundation of his approach, his belief that power could be maintained through fear, manipulation, and deceit. And with every line, she exposed the emptiness at the heart of his vision for the country. Pompeo opened his mouth again, but no words came. He was flustered, struggling to find a response, to salvage the position of authority he had held throughout his career. The silence hung in the air, growing heavier with each passing second. The crowd waited, breathless, as Pompeo stammered for a retort that never came. Kamala Harris, unwavering in her resolve, didn't let the silence linger. She had already delivered the final blow. "The truth is, Mike," she said, her voice calm but filled with moral clarity, "you're afraid of a world where we lead with compassion, with integrity, with justice. You're afraid of a world where we don't build walls but build bridges. You're afraid because, deep down, you know that what you've been selling, the lies, the fear-mongering, the corruption, isn't the strength this country needs. It's a weakness." Pompeo stood there, staring blankly. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. No words. No rebuttals. Nothing. The room was utterly still, and the deafening silence was the loudest statement of all. Kamala Harris had delivered her masterstroke, and in that moment, she had shattered the very narrative Pompeo had spent years constructing. She hadn't just defeated him in this debate, she had exposed him for who he truly was, and in doing so, had delivered a resounding victory for truth, justice, and the America that so many people still believed in. Pompeo stood there, defeated, unable to recover from the truth that had just been laid bare. Harris's victory wasn't just political, it was moral, and it was undeniable. And as the debate continued, one thing was certain: Harris had taken control, and Pompeo had lost his grasp. The moment Kamala Harris delivered her devastating counterattack, it was as if the world itself stopped and took notice. The room fell into a stunned silence, and even after the debate concluded, the echoes of her words reverberated far beyond the walls of that hall. Within minutes, social media exploded into a frenzy. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every platform was alight with reactions, as millions of viewers shared their thoughts, their outrage, and their admiration. The hashtag Harris wins began trending almost immediately, flooding timelines with praise, memes, and sound bites of her now infamous mic drop moment. Political pundits, once skeptical of Harris's ability to stand up to the seasoned Pompeo, now saw her in a new light. "She's not just a politician, she's a force," tweeted one prominent political analyst. Pompeo thought he could play the same game, but he couldn't keep up. Harris showed him what real leadership looks like. The victory was resonating with a vast swath of the population, especially those who had long felt sidelined by a political system that seemed to favor the powerful over the people. Immigrants, women, and people of color, who had long watched their voices be dismissed, found inspiration in Harris's poise and her unwavering commitment to justice. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, the quiet resilience it took to survive in a world that often didn't want to hear their truth. The responses came in a wave, news outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. CNN's coverage was dominated by the debate's aftermath, with pundits and political experts weighing in on what was being called a game-changing moment. "This is more than just a win for Harris," said one commentator. "This is a moment in history. We are witnessing the reshaping of the political landscape." Across the political spectrum, the reactions were split. Supporters of Harris flooded the internet with messages of solidarity and admiration. "Finally, someone who isn't afraid to call out the hypocrisy of the establishment," one tweet read. "Kamala is exactly the kind of leader we need." Others pointed out how her calm and measured response contrasted sharply with the aggression and fear-mongering often used in politics, particularly from figures like Pompeo. "This is how we need to lead, with clarity, with truth, with dignity," another supporter wrote. But it wasn't just Harris's supporters who were vocal. The fallout from Pompeo's defeat was swift and harsh. Political commentators on the right attempted to downplay the moment, but even they struggled to ignore the growing backlash. Pompeo's attempt to dismiss Harris as naive, as out of touch with the real world, had backfired spectacularly. His critics pointed out the contradictions in his own words, the contradictions that Harris had so expertly exposed. Pompeo's entire career has been based on talking tough, but it's clear he doesn't have the backbone to back it up, one conservative writer tweeted. What's more dangerous, Kamala Harris's diplomacy or Mike Pompeo's empty rhetoric? Celebrities, too, joined the conversation, amplifying the cultural shift that was unfolding. Actress and activist Kerry Washington tweeted, "Kamala Harris just reminded us what it means to fight with integrity." This is leadership. Hashtag Harris wins. Musicians, writers, and influencers alike echoed the sentiment, celebrating the way Harris had not only defended her principles but had done so with poise and grace, dismantling Pompeo's arguments with the force of truth. Meanwhile, Pompeo's silence after Harris's mic drop moment did not go unnoticed. His loyal base tried to rally in his defense, but the momentum was fading fast. A video of Harris's final words, her condemnation of Pompeo's hypocrisy, was shared across news sites and social media, gaining millions of views. The stark contrast between Harris's controlled, factual response and Pompeo's increasingly erratic, defenseless retorts painted a clear picture for anyone paying attention. The debate wasn't just a clash of ideologies, it was a clash of moral character. Across television screens, the conversation continued to grow. MSNBC, Fox News, and even international outlets were covering the fallout. What had started as a domestic political event had become a global spectacle. Kamala Harris just delivered a knockout punch, and Mike Pompeo has no answer, said one news anchor. This could redefine the political conversation for months to come. As hours passed, the narrative surrounding the debate began to solidify. Harris had shown that strength in leadership wasn't about posturing or building walls, it was about speaking the truth, standing by your values, and confronting the system, even when the odds were stacked against you. She had not only exposed Pompeo's hypocrisy, she had demonstrated the type of leadership that transcended party lines. For the first time, the nation saw what it could look like to have a leader who prioritized justice, equality, and diplomacy over division and fear. But just as the dust seemed to settle, a new twist emerged, one that would leave everyone questioning Pompeo's future. Word began to spread that Pompeo's campaign was in trouble, not just because of the debate but due to mounting internal pressures within his own party. Rumors of dissatisfaction among key supporters and donors began to swirl. His position as a political powerhouse seemed shakier than ever before. In the coming days, reports surfaced that Pompeo's team was scrambling to downplay the fallout, attempting damage control by issuing statements, but nothing seemed to silence the questions now looming over him. Was this the end of Pompeo's political career? Could he recover from this devastating blow, or had Kamala Harris's masterstroke irrevocably changed the dynamics of the race? The questions lingered, unanswered, as Harris's victory continued to resonate across the country. This wasn't just about one debate, it was about a moment in history that had shaken the political landscape, a moment that had revealed the true measure of leadership and exposed the deep fractures in the old political guard. As the nation watched, the world was forced to confront a new reality, the tides were shifting, and Kamala Harris had just become a central force in shaping that future. The dust from the debate had settled, but the weight of what had happened continued to linger in the air. Kamala Harris had done more than just win a political debate, she had delivered a masterclass in integrity, in leadership, and in moral courage. As the public absorbed the aftershocks of the confrontation, it was clear that this wasn't just a fleeting victory for Harris. This was a moment that would echo in the hearts and minds of Americans for years to come. In the days following the debate, Harris's name was everywhere. Headlines praised her for her poise and composure, but it wasn't just her ability to speak that had made an impact, it was her unwavering commitment to the truth. In a world where fear and division were so often used as tools of power, Harris had proven that there was another way, the way of dignity, of respect, of fighting for what was right even when it's not the easy path. For Kamala Harris, the moment was never about defeating Mike Pompeo, it was about demonstrating what real leadership looked like. She had reframed the debate from a political battle to a battle for the soul of the nation. In a time when so many politicians relied on fear, manipulation, and divisiveness to win support, Harris had shown the world that strength came not from tearing others down, but from building others up. Strength came from truth, from standing firm in your values, and from serving the people with honor. Her calm, steady response to Pompeo's attacks was more than just a strategic counter, it was a reminder of the power of integrity. Harris had faced down every form of political attack, from smears to misrepresentations, and had risen above it all. But rather than relying on the same tactics of fear and division that Pompeo used, she had stood as a beacon of what America could be if it returned to its founding ideals, a country that welcomed diversity, that valued justice over personal gain, and that believed in the power of truth above all else. And in that moment, Harris's words rang true not just in the debate hall, but across the entire nation. From the halls of Washington to the living rooms of everyday Americans, her message was heard loud and clear. Truth matters. Integrity matters. And when the world feels divided and broken, it's those values that hold the power to unite us and push us forward. The response from the American people was overwhelming. People who had once questioned Harris's ability to rise to the challenge now saw her in a new light. Her victory wasn't just a political win, it was a moral triumph. It was a sign that the country still had the capacity for leaders who could put truth above power, who could stand up for justice and fairness in a world that often seemed to reward corruption and dishonesty. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity and inspiration. Kamala Harris showed us what it means to fight with honor, one tweet read. She didn't just win, she reminded us that leadership is about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Another post reflected the sentiment of many, this is what real leadership looks like. This is what we need more of. But it wasn't just her supporters who were moved. Even those who had long been skeptical of Harris's approach found themselves reconsidering their views. The respect she earned wasn't just from political allies, it was from anyone who recognized the power of integrity and strength. The debate had transcended party lines and had become something bigger, a conversation about the kind of country Americans wanted to live in. And through it all, Kamala Harris had proven something else, that you didn't have to compromise your values to succeed. She had shown the world that moral victories were not only possible, but they could be the most powerful force of all. In an era where cynicism and partisanship often clouded the political landscape, Harris had restored faith in the idea that truth and justice could lead the way forward. Her victory wasn't just a turning point in a political race, it was a victory for anyone who had ever felt unheard, for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Harris had given them a voice, a reminder that standing up for what's right wasn't just a noble endeavor, it was the only way to make real change in the world. The final moments of the debate had been a microcosm of everything Harris stood for, unwavering confidence in the face of adversity, an unrelenting commitment to truth, and a refusal to be intimidated by those who would try to manipulate the system for their own gain. She hadn't just beaten Pompeo in a debate, she had exposed the heart of his argument as hollow, as deceptive, and as ultimately weak. And in the days and weeks to come, the conversations that started in that debate hall would continue. People would look back at that moment, remembering how Harris stood strong, how she pushed back against the narrative of fear and division, and how she showed the world that the power of truth, of living in alignment with your values, could bring down the most powerful walls. As she looked ahead to what was next, Kamala Harris knew one thing for sure, this battle was far from over. The struggle for truth, justice, and dignity was a lifelong fight, but with every victory like this one, she was reminding the world that the path forward would always be one paved by integrity, courage, and the unwavering belief that the right thing is always the strongest thing. Her words had resonated in that moment, but they would continue to echo for generations to come. As we look back on this defining moment, one thing is clear, Kamala Harris didn't just win a debate, she won a victory for truth, justice, and integrity. In the face of fear and manipulation, she stood tall, reminding us all that real strength comes not from tearing others down, but from building up the values that define us as a nation. She showed us that when we lead with dignity, when we stand by the truth, and when we refuse to let lies dictate our future, we have the power to change the world. This moment wasn't just about Harris. It was about all of us. It was about reclaiming the narrative that fear and division will never be the answer. It was about standing firm in what we know is right, even when the odds are stacked against us. This is the kind of leadership we deserve, leadership that prioritizes the people, that fights for justice, and that never backs down from doing what's morally right. Now, it's up to us to carry this momentum forward. The fight for truth, for fairness, and for a brighter future is far from over. If you believe in what Kamala Harris stood for in that debate, then it's time to take action. Share this video, spread the message, and be part of the movement that stands up for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and conviction, and join us in this ongoing fight for justice and integrity. The future is in our hands, and together, we can make sure it's a future defined by truth, dignity, and hope. Let's keep pushing for a world where integrity triumphs, where leaders stand for justice, and where every voice is heard. This is just the beginning. Join the movement. Be the change.